From the corridors of Congress to the heartbeat of punk and the roar of Soldier Field, 5 American originals left us in 2025 and left marks we still feel. Nita Lowey proved that budgets can be moral documents steering funds toward women, children education, and the arts. Alan Simpson cut through partisanship with candor and wit, reminding Washington that courage and compromise can coexist. Kitty Dukakis turned private struggle into public advocacy, giving language and dignity to conversations about addiction and mental health. Clem Burke powered Blondie with a kinetic swing that made clubs quake and radios sing. And Steve Mongo McMichael, a legend of the '85 Bears, met ALS with the same fearless intensity he once brought to the line of scrimmage. This isn't a catalog of loss, it's a map of influence. Stay with us as we trace their final chapters and the echoes they leave behind. Alan K. Simpson came to Washington as a rangy, funny Westerner and spent nearly 2 decades proving that candor and coalition building could coexist. Elected to the U.S. Senate from Wyoming in 1978, he served 3 terms, 1979, 1997, and a decade in GOP leadership as party whip, a post that required both arithmetic and empathy. His legislative footprint cut across fault lines. He helped craft the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act amnesty, paired with employer sanctions, championed veterans and public lands, and later co-chaired the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Deficit Reduction Commission in 2010, an emblem of his deficit hawkery and taste for hard compromises. Personally libertarian on some social issues, he backed abortion and gay rights, even as he remained a Reagan-era conservative, which is why colleagues on both sides saw him as a throwback to deal-making politics. Long after leaving office, he kept teaching jousting and joking, and in 2022 received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Simpson died in Cody, Wyoming, on March 14, 2025, at 93, after complications following a broken hip, leaving a model of old-school seriousness undercut by a one-liner. In his final years, Alan K. Simpson kept doing what had defined him since Wyoming first sent him to Washington, telling the truth as he saw it, and inviting the other side to the table. Long after retiring from the Senate in 1997, he co-chaired the Obama-era National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform in 2010, arguing sometimes impishly, always bluntly, that arithmetic should trump ideology. The same mix of candor and coalition-mindedness earned him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2022, with President Biden citing his independence on campaign reform and marriage equality as evidence that politics could be serious and humane at once. The coda to his public life unfolded back home. He taught, advised, and kept up a decades-long relationship with the Buffalo Bills Center of the West, where he had served on the board for more than half a century, an anchor institution for the place he never really left. In interviews and tributes, admirers reach for the same examples: his role in the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act amnesty, paired with employer sanctions, and his willingness, rare in any era, to defend abortion and gay rights from inside the Republican tent. Declining health finally crept into the narrative. After breaking a hip in December 2024, Simpson struggled to recover. On March 14, 2025, he died at 93 in Cody, surrounded by family. The obituaries read like civics lessons and campfire stories, at once part of vote counting and part one-liners, reminding readers that he was both a whip and a wit. They also suggested why his late career stature seemed to grow as the Capitol grew coarser. He made hard compromises without making enemies, and he laughed so everyone else could keep talking. On March 14, 2025, Alan K. Simpson died at 93 in Cody, Wyoming, after struggling to recover from a broken hip he suffered in December 2024. The news was shared by his family and the Buffalo Bills Center of the West, which noted that he passed away in Cody after months of complications tied to the injury. Initial reports stressed the plain facts date, age, place, cause, and the familiar picture of a statesman whose sharp wit and appetite for hard compromises outlasted the campaigns and committee rooms. Plans for public remembrance followed quickly. He would lie in honor at the Wyoming Capitol on March 27th, with additional services arranged so constituents and colleagues could pay their respects, an appropriately civic farewell for a lawmaker who prized institutions. The tone of early tributes matched the man they remembered, affectionate but unsentimental, focused on service rather than spectacle. In the headlines and statements, one thread kept returning Simpson's belief that politics should be the practice of adulthood, where numbers matter and friendships survive the vote. That more than any title was the final note many chose to strike as Wyoming and Washington marked his passing. Alan K. Simpson leaves a template for the hard work of self-government: tell the truth as you see it, count the votes, and keep the room laughing so the talking doesn't stop. Obituaries and tributes stressed his bipartisanship and ranged from immigration reform in 1986 to co-chairing the Simpson Bowl's Deficit Commission, alongside a libertarian streak on abortion and gay rights that often crossed party lines. In 2022, President Biden awarded Simpson the Presidential Medal of Freedom, later calling him one of the finest senators I ever served, with a line that doubled as an epitaph for his mixture of candor and coalition building. Remembrance also came from the institutions he tended. Fiscal hawks hailed a legend who insisted that arithmetic, not ideology, should govern budgets. Wyoming cultural leaders emphasized his half-century of service to the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Wyoming gave him a civic farewell, lying in honor at the state capitol in Cheyenne, before public memorials gathered former colleagues, students and neighbors to trade stories, equal parts civics and comedy. His record remains debated. Admirers cite courage and compromise. Critics argue his rhetoric on Social Security could be caustic and wrong. The fuller truth is that he kept showing up to argue it out and invited opponents to sit close. That is the legacy many chose to remember in March 2025. An old-school senator who believed friendship should survive the vote, and who proved again and again that seriousness and humor can share the same bench. Clem Burke was the kinetic engine behind Blondie's fusion of punk bite and disco new wave precision. Born in Bayonne, New Jersey in 1954, he joined the band in 1975 and turned club anthems into pop detonations. Think the whip-crack snare that powers One Way or Another, the tensile swing under Heart of Glass, and the lockstep urgency of Call Me. His stamina became a case study in itself. Sports scientists tracked his performances for years and found physiological demands comparable to elite athletes, a neat explanation for why his playing always felt like forward motion. Beyond Blondie Burke's feel, traveled widely briefly drumming, as Elvis Ramone for the Ramones recording and touring with the Eurythmics' Iggy Pop and others, evidence of how deeply musicians trusted his time. In 2006, Blondie entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, formalizing what peers already said aloud. Burke was the band's heartbeat, the hinge that made sharp songs dance. Even into his 70s, he carried himself like a craftsman, prepared, economical, and joyously loud, counting off tunes like a starter's pistol, and landing every fill exactly where the story needed it. By the 2010s and 2020s, Clem Burke had settled into a Craftsman's Rhythm Records festivals and a relentless live schedule whenever Blondie gathered, while side projects kept his hands sharp. His stamina remained legendary, but the final act was defined by discretion. In early April 2025, Blondie announced that Burke had died at 70 after a private battle with cancer, a phrase that captured how carefully he had ring-fenced his health from the public, even as he kept working. The band's tribute called him the heartbeat of Blondie, not just a timekeeper, but the propulsion that let pop hooks bite like punk and swing like disco. News outlets from Los Angeles to London echoed the sentiment, charting a line from CBGB to global radio. The whip of One Way or Another. the tensile glide of Heart of Glass, and the lockstep urgency of Call Me. In the weeks that followed, an unavoidable question surfaced: what becomes of Blondie without the engine that made sharp songs dance? Debbie Harry, grieving and candid, suggested she could no longer see herself on stage as Blondie without Burke and fellow founder Chris Stein, a reflection of how intertwined friendship and sound had become. His late career years then read less like a coda than a Creed show-up, prepared play for the song, leave the stage a little louder than you found it. On April 6, 2025, Clem Burke died at 70 after a private battle with cancer. The following day, Blondie announced the news on social media, calling him the band's heartbeat and emphasizing that his passing followed a private illness language that matched how carefully Burke had kept his health out of public view. Major outlets confirmed the announcement, and date-noting both his age and the cause, and quoting tributes from Debbie Harry and Chris Stein. In tone and detail, the statements felt unmistakably Blondie affectionate, plain-spoken, focused on work and spirit rather than spectacle. Fans, peers, and writers filled timelines with snapshots from CBGB to global festival stages, drum cam clips, tour posters, ticket stubs, each a small proof that his velocity had touched ordinary lives as surely as it did radio charts. Nothing in the official note courted melodrama. It didn't need to. For a drummer who treated time like a promise, counting and carrying the song, leaving the last cymbal to shimmer, the simple facts were enough. A long career, a private fight, and an exit marked by gratitude from the people who knew the beat best. Clem Burke's legacy is time itself, the way a drummer can make punk bite disco glide and pop detonate without losing the song. With Blondie's 2006 induction to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, his place in canon was sealed, a formal nod to the beat that powered Heart of Glass, Call Me, and Rapture. Tributes after his April 2025 passing were immediate and precise. Blondie called him the band's heartbeat, while major outlets traced his decades of work across clubs, charts, and comeback years. Debbie Harry, grieving and candid, later said she could no longer imagine being on stage as Blondie without Burke and founding guitarist Chris Stein, a measure of how inseparable his pulse was from the band's identity. Beyond Blondie, peers remembered a musician's musician, the quick study who could drop into Eurythmics or the Ramones, briefly as Elvis Ramone, and still sound unmistakably himself. Even scholars weighed in an oft-cited years-long study comparing elite athletic exertion to Burke's drumming, gave language to what audiences already felt in their bones. In the end, the morning settled around a simple truth. His greatest hook was momentum. Each count-off promised lift. Each chorus landed exactly where it should. The cymbal fades, but the tempo he set on records, on stages, and other players' hands keeps going. Kitty Dukakis turned the role of First Lady of Massachusetts into a platform for service and candor. Across decades beside Gavel, McMichael Dukakis, she championed refugees, the homeless, and mental health care, bringing statewide attention to people who rarely make the stump speech. Just as striking was her openness about her own struggles, addiction, and recurrent treatment-resistant depression. After finding relief through electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, she spoke publicly, wrote about it, and helped strip away stigma, arguing that honest storytelling can be a kind of public health. Her memoirs and advocacy made her a rare political spouse who altered the conversation as much as the optics and Friends describe a personality at once bracing and compassionate. In March 2025, she died at 88, with family at home in Brookline. Obituaries noted both the public causes and the private courage that defined her life. For this series, she belongs not only because of who she stood beside, but because of who she stood for and the way she modeled survival as service. In her later years, Kitty Dukakis turned candor into strategy. Having wrestled with addiction and treatment-resistant depression, she chose to talk about it openly, repeatedly, and then to write about what finally helped. After a course of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT changed the trajectory of her illness. she became one of the nation's most visible lay advocates for modern ECT, explaining risks and benefits without euphemism and co-authoring the 2006 book Shock to reduce stigma and offer patients a vocabulary for hope. The activism ran in parallel with a lifelong habit of standing beside people at the margins. Friends and colleagues remembered how she used the informal power of a governor's spouse to draw attention to refugees, the homeless, and those who felt stateless causes she kept at the center of her life long after the campaign buses were parked. Obituaries traced her imprint on Massachusetts' reception of Southeast Asian refugees and on the broader conversation about recovery, noting how her bluntness made space for others to speak. Privately, decline crept in. In 2025, her family said she died at 88 at home in Brookline after complications of dementia, an ending reported widely, and with the same plain-spokenness she prized. In May, a public memorial gathered neighbors, former staff, and advocates at Brookline High School, where speakers framed her legacy less as a resume than as a kind of permission to ask for help to tell the truth about illness to keep serving. Seen from the finish, her final act wasn't a retreat from public life, but a reframing of it. She took experiences many hide and turned them into policy conversations and practical lifelines, proof that vulnerability, when used carefully, can be a public service. On March 21st, 2025, Kitty Dukakis died at 88 at her home in Brookline, Massachusetts, after complications from dementia with family at her side. Early reports citing statements from loved ones described a peaceful passing that matched the plain-spokenness she brought to public life. Obituaries quickly established the essential facts and frame a First Lady who turned advocacy into a vocation and a candid voice who spoke publicly about addiction, depression, and the treatment that helped her. National outlets and local papers aligned on the details, date, age, place, cause, while recalling her decades of work on behalf of refugees, the homeless, and mental health care. Plans for remembrance followed. The family announced a public memorial at Brookline High School on May 11, 2025, giving neighbors, former staff, and advocates a place to gather and speak. Coverage of the service emphasized the same themes that marked her life service: candor and the belief that telling the truth about illness can be its own kind of public health. Kitty Dukakis changed what it meant to be a political spouse by making vulnerability part of public service. Long before it was common, she spoke plainly about addiction and treatment-resistant depression, and then helped people name their options, co-authoring Shock: The Healing Power of Electroconvulsive Therapy, 2006, a book that demystified ECT for families and clinicians alike. Obituaries and tributes remembered the same pairing of candor and care advocacy for mental health treatment, alongside decades of work for refugees, the homeless, and those who feel unseen. In May 2025, a public memorial at Brookline High School, the place where she and McMichael Dukakis first met, became a community tutorial in gratitude. Speakers traced how her blunt honesty lowered stigma and how her steady presence turned attention into action. The lesson her mourners kept repeating is simple and transferable: tell the truth, ask for help, and keep showing up for people at the margins. That template survives in policy conversations she influenced, and in private lives made more livable because someone brave said out loud what others were afraid to name. As one remembrance put it, never underestimate what one person can change, especially when she insists that compassion and clarity belong in the same sentence. For 3 decades in Congress, Nita Lowey turned the dry mechanics of appropriations into a moral argument. Budgets reveal what a nation values. Representing suburban communities north of New York City, she built a reputation as a fierce but pragmatic dealmaker, championing women's health education, the arts, and global development priorities she framed as investments rather than line items. In 2019, she made history as the first woman to chair the House Appropriations Committee, a perch from which she helped steer omnibus negotiations through volatile political weather, without letting social programs become collateral. Colleagues across the aisle often described her as simultaneously tough and gracious a listener who could count votes and count on long relationships to close a gap. Lowey retired in 2021 after 32 years in the House, leaving behind a template for values-driven budgeting that outlived any single fiscal year. She died on March 15, 2025 at 87 after a private battle with metastatic breast cancer, surrounded by family at her home in Harrison, New York, an ending that echoed the steadiness she brought to public life. In her final act, Nita Lowey turned seniority into stewardship. When she became the first woman to chair the House Appropriations Committee in 2019, she treated negotiations less like combat than caretaking, pressing for women's health education and global development, while keeping the government's lights on through volatile showdowns. After 32 years in Congress, she retired in 2021, but the phone never stopped ringing. Younger members still sought her counsel, and colleagues across the aisle praised her as a quiet architect of bipartisan deals. The closing months were private. On March 15, 2025, her family said she died peacefully at home in Harrison, New York, after a private battle with metastatic breast cancer, language that matched a career defined by resolve rather than spectacle. Tributes arrived in a chorus that spanned parties and institutions. Chairman Tom Cole called her passing a great sadness, an acknowledgement from a Republican successor of how she modeled the committee at its best. Rosa DeLauro saluted a champion for the people of New York and the trailblazer who first broke the chair's glass ceiling. Leader Hakeem Jeffries praised her mentorship. Senator Chuck Schumer remembered the heart of the Hudson Valley. Local obituaries grounded the national praise in place, a Westchester public servant who spent 3 decades delivering for the communities just north of New York City. AP noted that the family planned a private funeral with a public memorial to follow, fitting for a lawmaker who believed the work should outlive the moment. In the end, the record is plain: first to the gavel, last to grandstand, and always arguing that a budget is a moral document because it tells line by line who we choose to protect. On March 15, 2025, Nita Lowey died at 87 at her home in Harrison, New York, after a private battle with metastatic breast cancer, surrounded by her husband, children, and grandchildren. Her family's statement, shared with local party officials and national outlets, described a quiet, resolute fight carried with the same tenacity she brought to 32 years in Congress. Initial reports quickly established the facts and the frame: the first woman ever to chair House Appropriations, a lawmaker who treated budgets as moral documents, and a mentor whose influence stretched well beyond New York's Hudson Valley. Plans reflected that balance of public service and private grace, a private funeral and burial with a memorial service to follow, so constituents and colleagues could pay respects. In the hours after the announcement, tributes began to arrive from both parties. Formal notes from congressional leaders, remembrances from appropriators who had negotiated with her for decades, and hometown acknowledgments that tied national headlines back to the communities she represented. The details were simple, and that felt apt to peaceful passing at home. A family gathered, a record that would speak for itself when the public said goodbye. Nita Lowey's legacy lives in the hard math of budgets and the soft power of mentorship. As the first woman to chair the House Appropriations Committee, she showed that fiscal choices can advance women's health education and the arts while keeping government's lights on. Her elevation to the gavel in 2019 codified decades of quiet deal-making and widened the path for women to lead in the room where the numbers are written. Obituaries emphasize the sweep of her 32 years in Congress and the values she insisted those numbers reflect, from public health priorities to global development. The bipartisan respect was immediate. Chairman Tom Cole mourned her passing and praised the diligence and integrity that defined her stewardship of appropriations. Leader Hakeem Jeffries saluted a mentor whose counsel shaped a generation of lawmakers, and Senator Chuck Schumer remembered the heart of the Hudson Valley, a trailblazer whose effectiveness still resonates. Her family's plan for a private funeral with a memorial to follow matched the balance she favored between service and ceremony. What remains is a template treat, a budget as a moral document. Protect the people easiest to overlook. Negotiate hard without making yourself the story. In the tributes and in the programs she helped fund, you can still see the through-line steadiness, empathy, and a belief that government can and should make daily life work a little better. Steve Mongo McMichael embodied Chicago's favorite myth, toughness, with a grin. Born in Houston in 1957 and forged at the University of Texas, he arrived in the NFL as a mid-round Patriot, then became a franchise pillar, with the Bears stringing together a team record 191 consecutive games at defensive tackle. On the 1985 Super Bowl, Dukakis champions his relentlessness and mischief, made him both enforcer and spark, plug the kind of player who could blow up a guard at the snap and crack a joke before the next huddle. Honors followed first-team All-Pro Pro Bowls and later a second act in WCW as a charismatic bruiser who treated the ring like another line of scrimmage. In 2021, McMichael disclosed he had ALS. In 2024, football finally answered years of campaigning by inducting him into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, an emotional home ceremony reflecting how beloved he was in Chicago and beyond. He died in 2025 at 67, but the image remains the snarl, the quick hands, the bear hug for teammates and fans. Even now you can feel him in the city's cadence, blue-collar, loud and joyfully unbreakable. The final arc of Steve Mongo McMichael's life was defined by candor, community, and an unembarrassed toughness. In April 2021, he disclosed he had ALS. The announcement reintroduced Chicago to a different kind of grit, hospital rooms and ramps, instead of the three technique, a fight paced by caregivers and friends as much as by doctors. What followed was a civic campaign, grassroots and loud, for the Hall of Fame to recognize a player whose value was never only in the box score. In August 2024, too frail to travel, McMichael was presented his gold jacket and bust. At home, a living room enshrinement that felt exactly right for a city that prefers its myths close enough to touch. He still loomed over Sundays, the 191 consecutive games for the Bears. An ironman streak at defensive tackle became shorthand for the way he carried himself through illness, relentless, funny, in the dark, impossible to count out. On April 23, 2025, McMichael died at 67 from complications of ALS. The team's remembrance read like a family note, plain spoken about the disease, careful with the man. And national outlets amplified the news with highlights that spanned Soldier Field, WCW ring walks, and barstool storytelling. A few weeks later, the Bears hosted a celebration of life, a communal exhale that matched Chicago's idiom, tell. The stories played, the clips hugged the people who showed up. In the montage, you can see the whole thesis of his career, disruption, laughter, and an embrace that could lift teammates off the ground. On April 23, 2025, Steve Mongo McMichael died at 67 from complications of ALS. Earlier that day, his family team moved him into hospice care. Within hours, the news of his passing was confirmed widely. The Pro Football Hall of Fame noted that he died with friends and family at his side, plain words that fit a life spent in crowded locker rooms and roaring stadiums. The Chicago Bears' remembrance read like a letter from home. Chairman George H. McCaskey called him the club's Ironman, praising the grace and dignity he showed throughout his illness. National outlets echoed the facts and the feeling age-date disease, and filled the frame with highlights from Soldier Field stories of locker room mischief and the improbable second act in pro wrestling. He is survived by his wife Misty and daughter Macy, names that recurred across tributes as the city took stock of what it had lost and what it had learned, that toughness can be tender, and that a grin can carry you a long way through the dark. Steve Mongo. McMichael's legacy rests on a rare blend of ferocity, durability, and showmanship. On the field, he was the Bears' metronome, a club record 191 consecutive games at defensive tackle, and 92.5 career sacks, second in franchise history numbers that explain why teammates called him their constant. He anchored the 1985 Super Bowl defense that defined a generation, and after football carried the same big room charisma into WCW, where he turned gridiron bravado into ringside theater. In August 2024, pro football finally enshrined what Chicago had argued for years. McMichael entered the Pro Football Hall of Fame. When he died on April 23, 2025, having entered hospice earlier that day, the Hall's remembrance framed him as the personification of toughness, a line that felt as much about the fight with ALS as about Sundays at Soldier Field. The Bears' own tributes, including an emotional celebration of life the next month, kept the focus on the man, relentless, funny, civic-minded, the Ironman whose grit could fill a stadium and a living room. That is what endures in Chicago's cadence, a snarl that came with a grin, a tackle who never stopped showing up, and a city that still tells his stories on cold mornings and warm bar stools alike. In the space these 5 lives leave behind, we can hear what they taught. Influence is not one shape. It can be a vote that protects a classroom, a drum that moves a crowd, a tackle that lifts a city, a voice that makes hard arithmetic human, a confession that turns stigma into help. Nita Lowey, Clem Burke, Steve, Mongo, McMichael, Alan Simpson, Kitty Dukakis. Different callings, the same through line of service and courage. If one of them changed, you say how. Tell us the song, you still play the game. You still replay the policy that still matters, the truth that helped you heal. And if their stories reached you today, stay with this channel, subscribe, share a memory in the comments, and help us keep honoring lives that still echo beyond the headline.